So in this video, I want to show you a little bit more of a complicated problem. It's actually number 4 on the worksheet that I gave you yesterday. There's going to be one additional step to this problem because our leading coefficient of x squared is no longer going to be 1. So let's just look at it. Number 4 on the worksheet that I gave you yesterday says y is equal to 2x squared plus 36x plus 170. Okay? Now this function is in standard form, but we want to rewrite this function in vertex form, which in general we know is y is equal to a x minus h squared plus k. So the goal is to take this function, which is in standard form, and to sort of hit it with a math stick and rewrite it in this form. Okay, so let's just go and get started. Let's start by first identifying the difference between this problem and the last problem. So this problem, if we look at the x squared term, okay, if we look at the x squared term, we no longer have a 1 in front of the x squared, which is a problem. Okay, so the very first step when you're doing this, trying to convert to vertex form, you need to make sure that you have a 1 in front of your x squared. Now there are several different ways that you can do this. Okay, so most of you are going to probably want to, or your first inclination is going to be to divide every single term by 2, which is fine. You can do that as long as you keep track of that 2, and whatever you do to one side of the equation, you do to the other. But I want to show you a method that incorporates factoring, because that's what we've been practicing for the past 2 weeks, is factoring. So let's go ahead and practice this. Let's rewrite this expression. Y is equal to 2x squared plus 36x plus 170. Now let's group some terms together. So this is a lot like one of the problems that you had on your last test, where I said to factor by grouping. And then you picked a couple terms to group together, and then you picked a couple more terms to group together, and then you factored something out. So in this case, okay, let's group these first 2 terms together, and then we'll factor something out of this. Now, let me ask you, what do I need to factor out of this expression to make sure that my squared variable term has a 1 out front? So hopefully you were able to say that we need to factor out a 2 from this part that we have grouped to get a 1 in front of this x squared. Okay, so what does that look like? If I want to factor out a 2 from this expression, the way that I do that is I do y is equal to 2, so I'm pulling a 2 out of this part that I've grouped. I'm pulling my 2 out front in front of the parentheses. So I've pulled out my 2, and I'll close parentheses. Now remember, what do I need to do with every single term inside the parentheses to figure out what goes in here? So let's maybe do this one at a time. What do I need to divide this by to find out what goes right here? What's going to be my first term inside the parentheses? So hopefully you were able to say that we need to divide this first term by 2 to figure out what goes in here. Now let's see what that looks like. Maybe it'll help if I write it off to the side. So I do 2x squared divided by 2. Now 2 over 2, those just cancel out, and I'm left with x squared. So my first term inside the parentheses is going to be an x squared. Now, I do want to just take a moment and clarify something. You guys are used to factoring out the greatest common factors. So before, we would say, what's the greatest common factor of this part in parentheses? And in this case, it would be 2x, and then we would factor out a 2x. But we're not factoring out the GCF. Here, we're just factoring out a 2. And since we're factoring out a 2, we need to divide every single term in the parentheses by 2 to find out what goes down here. So now, I'm going to ask you another question. What do I need to divide 36x by to find out what my second term is going to be? Yeah, so it's the same as before. Since we're factoring out a 2, we need to divide 36x by 2 to find out what goes here. So I'll write this over on the side. I'll do 36x, we divide it by 2. Now we're not just halving this, okay? We're not just halving this. Because we're factoring out a 2, we're dividing it by 2. If I were factoring out a 3, I would divide this by 3. If I were factoring out an x, I would divide this by x. But since we're factoring out a 2, 36x divided by 2 is equal to, okay, so 36 divided by 2, that's going to give me 18. Now, I want to go ahead and point out something here that I've noticed is a common mistake in our class. A lot of people forget to carry this x over. So they'll do 36 divided by 2 and they'll write 18, but don't forget about this variable. That variable doesn't just disappear when you do 36 divided by 2. So we need to carry that x over with our 18, so we get 18x. So that tells us what our next term is going to be. So plus 18x, close parentheses, and then plus 170. So we're almost there. You can see that our expression is starting to look something like this. It's getting there, but the only problem is right here we've got an expression in parentheses being squared. Right now we've just got an expression in parentheses that's not being squared. So now we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to add to these two terms inside the parentheses? So let me just give us a little bit of room to work with. Y is equal to 2 x squared plus 18x, and then plus or minus something, and then plus 170. So the question is, what do I need to add to these two terms to make this a perfect square trinomial? That is, what do I need to add to these two terms to complete the square? What do you think? What do I need to add right here to complete the square? Yeah, so from the looks of it, it looks like you guys are getting very comfortable completing the square. And it looks like most of you said, well, I need to find the coefficient of my x term, which in this case is 18. Then I need to half it and square it to find out what goes right here to complete the square. So let me just write it off to the side. We do 18, we half it, so we half it, and then we square it. Okay, and I halved it by dividing by 2, or by multiplying by 1/2. It's however you want to think about it. So 18 divided by 2, that's equal to 9, and then 9 squared is equal to 81. So this tells us this 81 is what we need to add to these two terms to make this part, in parentheses, a perfect square trinomial. So I add, I'll do this in a different color, 81 inside here to make all of this a perfect square trinomial. Now, we can't just add 81 without correcting for it. Okay, so we did something to this side, and it's not okay just to add this, so we have to either add or subtract something to this side or to the other side to make this a balanced equation. Okay, now let's take a moment. You may notice that I've left a blank here. I've left a blank in between the parentheses and the 170. What do you think needs to be added right here to make sure that this stays a balanced equation? So most of you probably said, based off of the last example, that we need to subtract 81 right here, but that's not quite correct. And the reason is because now we have a 2 out here. So if I were to distribute this 2 to every single term, I'd say 2x squared, 2 times 18, that's 36x, and then 2 times 81, right? So 2 times 81. What is 2 times 81? 2 times 81 is 162. So when you added this 81 inside these parentheses, you're not just adding 81. You're actually adding 81 times 2, which is 162. So we don't need to just subtract 81 here. We actually need to subtract 162 to make sure that this stays a balanced equation. Now that's kind of tricky. So if you didn't understand what I just did here, you need to pause the video, pause the video and raise your hand, and we'll walk through it together to make sure you understand why I subtracted 162 and not 81. So go ahead, take a moment. If you don't understand this, raise your hand and we'll talk about it together. So hopefully at this point you understand why we subtracted 162 and not 81 to make this equation balanced. So let's go ahead and continue on with the problem. So here in parentheses we have a perfect square trinomial. That is, we added 81 to complete the square, so now we can factor it using that trick that I taught you. So we know that this is y is equal to 2, and we know that this part in parentheses is always going to have a general form whenever it's a perfect square, which it is now. Now that we've added the 81, this is a perfect square. So if I want to factor this, it's going to have the form x plus or minus something, close parentheses, squared, okay? And then I'm just going to go ahead and combine these two, so negative 162 plus 170, that's just going to be positive 8, so plus 8. So the question is, what do I need to add or subtract inside these parentheses to factor this perfect square trinomial? What do you think? So hopefully you were able to say that we just look at the coefficient of x and we just half it to find out what needs to go in here. So positive 18 divided by 2, that's going to give me positive 9. Whereas here, okay, the 81, we halved 18 and then squared it. Here, we just half 18 and we add it inside here. So now we have factored this part of the expression to get x plus 9 squared. Now, you tell me, is this now in vertex form? Yeah, so this is definitely in vertex form. So this is the final answer here. So I'll just put a box around it so you know that we have now taken our expression and put it into vertex form. Now, don't just take my word for it. Actually plug this equation, graph this equation in Desmos, and then graph this function in Desmos, and make sure that you get the exact same graphs. Because if this is indeed the same as this, you should get the exact same graphs. Now, let's just go to the next slide really quick, and let's identify our A, our H, and our K before we conclude this video. So I've already rewritten it on the next slide. Here we go. We just compare our quadratic in vertex form to this. And I say, okay, A is the number in front of the parentheses. A is the number in front of the parentheses. So I know my A in this case, okay, A is the number in front of the parentheses. What's in front of the parentheses? A2. Okay, now you go ahead. What do you think H and K are going to be? So this one too is a little bit tricky because here you'll notice that we've got minus H here. Okay, so we've got negative H is the second term inside the parentheses. So really what you should put in this case for H is negative H, okay, we say negative H is equal to 9, positive 9. Okay, so negative H is equal to positive 9, which means that H is equal to negative 9. Okay, so my H in this case is actually negative 9. And then finally, if I want to solve or figure out what my K is, it's just whatever's being added to the first part. So here's my first part plus K, here's my first part plus 8, and that tells me that K is equal to 8. So here's my K, here's my H, and here's my A. Okay guys, so go ahead and go to the next Educated video where we're going to look at graphing. We're going to work with graphing functions in vertex form. And if you have any questions about this video, just raise your hand and ask. Thanks guys.